In tonight's news edition, His Majesty tells Lower House Speaker and members that violence and anarchy on campuses or elsewhere in society must be treated as an adverse trend that is beginning to affect people's daily life. Fighting continues unabated in Syria as Turkey calls for the international community to take action against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And protests erupt on the streets of Cairo as members of the April 6 youth movement denounce the Muslim Brotherhood for detaining political activists. Good evening and welcome to the news at 10. His Majesty the King has once again asserted the supremacy of law as the pillar of the state and guarantor of the citizens' democracy and the country's security and stability. His Majesty was speaking during a meeting with Lower House Speaker and members to discuss public and national concern and highlight the growing trend of violence in the midst of Jordanians. Farah Ajlouni has the details.
His Majesty told Lower House Speaker and members that violence and anarchy in campus or elsewhere in society must be treated as an adverse trend that is beginning to affect people's daily life. King Abdullah said the three branches of government must share the responsibility of drafting a plan to address violence and urged the legislature to cooperate with the executive and the judiciary bodies in legislating and implementing the law with firmness, audacity, transparency, and a zero tolerance. On the participation of deputies in government as cabinet ministers, His Majesty advised a gradual process and called for updating the House's Code of Conduct to ensure that the work of parliamentary blocks is institutionalized and is consistent. His Majesty gave the deputies a point to ponder, saying if the ultimate objective of reform is a parliamentary government, what is the priority for deputies? To take up cabinet portfolios or to upgrade the House as an institution? He urged for the national interest to top all other interests, highlighting the size of responsibility that lies ahead of the House at this phase, namely to embark on the needed legislation. The King again cautioned the deputies to stay abreast with their constituencies' needs through direct communication. On the situation in Syria, His Majesty affirmed that all possible measures are taken to ensure the security and stability of Jordan and cited ongoing diplomatic efforts to find a transitional political solution that could avert the collapse of division of Syria. House Speaker Saad Hail Surur, for his part, listed draft legislation completed or underway and said a code of conduct will be on the table for endorsement by the end of this month. Surur said in light of the enormous task before the House, deputies now convene in 3 weekly sessions, 1 for oversight and 2 for legislation. Surur said House members are utilizing regional and international parliamentary forums where MPs can lobby their governments to voice Jordan's concern and convey the kingdom's need for support, especially with relation to hosting Syrian refugees. Farah Ajlouni for the news at 10.
Separately, His Majesty received a delegation representing the Konrad Adenauer, led by its chairman Hans-Gert Pöttering. His Majesty discussed with the delegation ways to forge closer ties between Jordan and Germany and reviewed with them developments in Syria as well as efforts to achieve peace in the region. His Majesty also spoke of Jordan's reform drive aimed at enhancing democracy and achieving comprehensive development in the kingdom. On Syria, His Majesty highlighted the burden of hosting a growing influx of Syrian refugees on the kingdom's resources and urged the international community to make a contribution. Pöttering conveyed to His Majesty the greetings of German Chancellor Angela Merkel and President of the European Parliament Martin Schulz. Members of the delegation voiced agreement that the Palestinian issue and efforts to achieve peace in the region should remain a top priority for the international community. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour affirmed the historical ties and shared values between Jordan and Turkey, saying both countries are witnessing increased cooperation at all levels. Mansour was addressing an international symposium in Amman entitled Common Denominators and Cultural Exchange Between Turks and Arabs. He said a Turkish trade delegation will arrive in the kingdom on the 20th to be followed by a visit by Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the signing of 24 trade pacts between the two countries. Erdogan will attend the commission of a Turkish free trade zone in Aqaba as a gateway to Turkish exports to East and South African countries. Mansour will hold talks with Erdogan on establishing Turkish factories in Al Mafraq area in order to revive Jordanian-Turkish land trade, which has been adversely affected by the Syrian crisis. The symposium continues for 4 days, during which Arab and Turkish experts will present 28 working papers focusing on Arab-Turkish ties. Minister for Foreign and Expatriate Affairs Nasser Joude met here in Amman with European Commissioner for International Cooperation, Humanitarian and Crisis Response, Kristalina Georgieva. The meeting focused on the Syrian refugee situation in Jordan and services ordered to the hundreds of thousands of Syrians at refugee camps. Georgieva said the European Union has disbursed 100 million euros it had pledged at the donors' conference in Kuwait. She also said an additional 65 million euros will also be presented as emergency aid for Syrian refugees in Jordan and other host countries. Jordan has condemned the criminal bombing that rocked the southern Turkish town of Rihanli yesterday. Minister of State for Media Affairs and Communications, Mohammed al-Momani, reiterated Jordan's rejection of all forms of violence. He voiced Jordan's solidarity with the Turkish people and government and expressed sorrow over the loss of lives in the attack. In the town of Rihanli, meanwhile, protesters erupted following the twin blast that hit on Turkish-Syrian border. Some blamed Syrian residents and smashed their car windows, while others rallied against Turkey's foreign policy. The Turkish government said it will take all necessary measures needed to protect itself and threatened to react to provocations with even more aggression. Lu'ay Balqar has more.
Hundreds of mourners attended the funerals of the victims in Rihanli, a town and district of Hatay province near the country's border with Syria, which is now home to thousands of Syrian refugees. The bombings were the bloodiest incidents on Turkish soil since Syria's conflict began more than 2 years ago, with at least 43 people killed and 140 more injured in the attack. Turkish Interior Minister blamed Syria's government, saying the bombing had links to President Bashar al-Assad's regime.
I can clearly say that the attacks were carried out by a group whose name and activities are known to us, and which has direct links with Syria's Muharabat intelligence agency.
The Syrian Information Minister denied any Syrian involvement and blamed the Turkish government for the deadly car bombings.
Everything that has happened in Syria is the responsibility of the Turkish government. And what happened yesterday is also the responsibility of the Turkish government.
The United States strongly condemned the attacks and vowed support in identifying those responsible, while NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen and French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius voiced full solidarity with Turkey. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's office voiced hope the perpetrators would be swiftly brought to justice. The damage went at least 3 blocks deep from the site of the blast, scattering concrete blocks, smashing cars, and restaurants and cafes were destroyed. Turkish authorities have detained 9 people and believe fighters loyal to the Syrian regime were behind the devastating twin bombs. Sending out a strong message to the international community through its foreign minister, Turkey demanded the UN Security Council to act against the Syrian president and to reach a common position on Syria.
We regret that the Security Council of the United Nations has not done its job, and we can see how a tiny spark has now turned into a serious fire. For 2 years, the Security Council has shown it does not care about the Syrian people, about Turkey's security.
The bombing increased fears that Syria's civil war is dragging in neighboring countries, despite renewed diplomatic moves towards ending 2 years of fighting, in which more than 70,000 people have been killed. Lu'ay Balqar for the news at 10.
The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has produced fresh updates on the number of Syrians killed since the start of the civil war, putting the total at 82,000, while more than 12,000 are missing. In Cairo, head of the Arab League, Nabil Arabi, welcomed a new effort by Russia and the United States to seek a negotiated end to Syria's civil war and called on the Syrian government and opposition to participate. Speaking at a news conference following an Arab League summit in the Egyptian capital, Al-Arabi said the people of Syria must decide on the future of their country and their president, not the international community. Al-Arabi said he believes that consensus by two of the world's main players is a leap forward in attempts to end the Syrian conflict. Meanwhile, Syria's opposition coalition announced it will meet in Istanbul on the 23rd of this month to decide whether to participate in the US-Russian-sponsored conference. The coalition's General Assembly said it will also elect a new head for the coalition following heavy criticism of Provincial Prime Minister Ghassan Hito. On the ground, meanwhile, fighting continues unabated in Syria as Turkey calls for the international community to take action against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Syrians posted more amateur videos on the internet showing a government jet bombing the eastern Ghouta district of Damascus. Other footage shows rebels in Hims exchanging gunfire with what is said to be government forces as explosions were heard going off nearby. We stay with Syria, and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon welcomed the release of 4 UN disengagement observers who were held by Syrian rebels and called on all parties to respect the freedom of movement, safety and security of UN personnel. Syrian rebels today freed the 4 Filipino UN peacekeepers whom they had captured on the ceasefire line between Syria and the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights last week. A spokesman for the Philippine Armed Forces said the 4 have already been taken back to their battalion in the UN peacekeeping force on the Golan Heights and appear to have suffered no harm. Over to Egypt, and 2 years after the overthrow of former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, the country remains polarized. Protesters took to the streets in Cairo as members of the April 6 youth movement denounced the Muslim Brotherhood for detaining political activists. U.S. State Department spokesman Patrick Ventrell said the United States is seeking confirmation about those accusations and would express concern if they were true. Here's more in this report.
Protests in Cairo as members of the April 6th youth movement denounced the ruling Muslim Brotherhood for detaining political activists. Holding pictures of the detainees, they demonstrated in front of the Supreme Court, calling for the downfall of the regime and the resignation of Muslim Brotherhood leaders. On Friday, prominent activist Ahmed Meher, who leads the April 6th movement, was arrested. The next day, public prosecutors ordered his release without charge. The state news agency listed the reasons for his detention as resisting the authorities, insulting police, and gathering and obstructing traffic. Meher said President Mohamed Morsi's Islamist-led government was no different to Egypt's former leader Hosni Mubarak's regime, which cracked down on dissenters. He said his movement, at the forefront of the protests that overthrew Mubarak, will continue to push for change. Meanwhile, another prominent activist, Ahmed Douma, went on trial last Sunday, charged with insulting Morsi.
And when we come back, Her Majesty Queen Rania visits Irbid to check on the construction work done by the Madrasati Initiative, and the city of Los Angeles goes green by promoting a day of car use abstinence.
عن جد مع الغد الكل ربحان. اشترك أو جدد اشتراكك لمدة عامين لتقشر وتربح العديد من الجوائز.
Back here at home, Her Majesty Queen Rania visited 2 schools in Al-Ashrafiyya and Irbid to check on the construction work done by the Madrasati initiative as part of its 5th phase, which includes around 100 schools in the Northern Governorate. Her Majesty met with school principals to discuss the improvements and the extracurricular activities implemented by the initiative. Following the meeting, Queen Rania checked on several workshops and activities carried out by Madrasati volunteers, as well as the positive effects the improvements had on schools' environment and the teaching-learning process. Concluding her visit, Her Majesty stopped by a school's computer lab where an online music teaching workshop was taking place. The U.S. city of Los Angeles was crowned king of congestion once again, as it earned the dubious distinction of having America's worst traffic, according to a recent report by traffic data service INRIX. According to INRIX, Los Angeles has 4 of the most congested freeways in the U.S., with an average of 2 days to drive or park on. Officials have been looking for ways to get people out of their cars for years, recently promoting a day of car use abstinence. Zain Abu Soufa has the story. Barcelona fans, especially our very own Alia Touqan, couldn't hide their excitement as they celebrated their team's 22nd La Liga trophies in the last 5. Barca were top from the opening day of the campaign and were only 10 rebounds for the Spurs. Klay Thompson scored 17 points to lead the Warriors. Stephen Curry added 16 points and 8 assists, but still it was not enough. Game 4 is on Sunday in Oakland.
Leonard driving, got past Barnes, and the lead is 11. Smaller lineup, Landry trying to defend Tim Duncan. And Duncan falling away gets his 23rd point. He's never going to roll. They reclaim home court advantage.
And finally, for a quick look at the weather, partly cloudy tonight with northwesterly moderate to brisk winds and a chance for local light showers. Tomorrow, moderate and partly cloudy conditions prevail in a continued chance for rain accompanied by thunder. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect a relatively hot day tomorrow with southerly moderate winds and slightly choppy seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. To end the news, here's a reminder of our top stories. His Majesty tells Lower House Speaker and members that violence and anarchy on campuses or elsewhere in society must be treated as an adverse trend that is beginning to affect people's daily life. Fighting continues unabated in Syria as Turkey calls for the international community to take action against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And protests erupt on the streets of Cairo as members of the April 6 youth movement denounce the Muslim Brotherhood for detaining political activists. With that, we come to the end of tonight's news. I'm Nancy Khair. Thank you for watching and have a good night.